Good morning. Today's lecture will focus upon what historians call Reconstruction. Reconstruction will occur from 1865 to 1877. This will be the 12 years that will occur after the Civil War. It will be a very turbulent period. For African Americans, it will be the time period that this nation will attempt to determine how to deal with newly freed uh, people who had been in slavery. It will be the nation during the time period the nation will try to reintegrate the southern states into the union. There will be a lot of good things that will come out of Reconstruction, but there will also be by 1877 the nation will be moving towards the road towards the Jim Crow era. And firm believer that the downfall of Reconstruction will be that African Americans did not receive their 40 acres and a mule. So when we talk about Reconstruction, uh, you can really say that, like so many events, you have to know what happened before the event actually occurred. In other words, you have to know what was happening before Reconstruction. And we need to go back to the onset of the Civil War. Uh, there were radical individuals who we would call radical abolitionists. An abolitionist was someone who wanted to end slavery. A radical abolitionist would be someone who wanted to clearly say that the Civil War was being fought to end slavery. And over a majority of these individuals will be located in the North. Uh, but President Lincoln did not make abolition of slavery a goal for the Union effort. In fact, as I stated, he wrote a letter to an editor, Horace Greeley, and he said if he could win the war by ending slavery, he would, and if he could win the war by not ending slavery, he would do that. Okay. His fear is that to end slavery would drive the border states that were still loyal to the Union and to the Confederacy, and it would anger more conservative Northerners. In other words, once again, in the history of this nation, politics will be more important than the freedom of a group of people, and that freedom will be uh, more important than the freedom of African Americans. The situation began to change by the summer of 1862, when to a great degree African Americans who were slaves began to push themselves into the issue. Uh, they began to run away from their Confederate slave masters, and they will head by thousands to the Union lines as Lincoln's troops will march through the South. Now, uh, this will help to convince Lincoln that emancipation had to become a political and a military necessity. A military necessity because he finally understood that the contrary to what a lot of whites thought that African Americans would not fight, that they did in this case want to fight. They wanted to participate because, as I said in class, they wanted to prove that they were men and that they wanted to say that they earned their freedom and they were willing to die for their cause, for this cause. Okay. Uh, in response, as we know, Lincoln will pass the Emancipation Proclamation. And as I said, legally, the Emancipation Proclamation will not free anyone, okay, because of the way it was worded. But we won't focus upon the law right now. We'll focus upon that eventually 3 million enslaved people in the Confederate States will, on January the 1st, 1863, be legally free if they were not actually free. And African Americans began to enlist in the Union Army in large numbers that, as I've stated before, 180,000 African Americans will serve in the Union Army by the end of the war. So emancipation will change the stakes of the Civil War. And this will mean emancipation will mean that a Union victory would mean large scale social revolution in the South. And what was that revolution? Well, the revolution was going to be that now African Americans were going to be free. But there are just going to be so many questions about how how were the whites going to react? What would this mean to the African Americans? So I think the politicians saw what was coming, but they weren't prepared to handle what was coming. So over the next 3 years, then Lincoln, before his assassination, considered ideas how to welcome the devastated South back into the Union. But as the war drew to a close in 1865, he still did not have a clear plan. And in fact, he delivered a speech on April 11th, where he talked about Reconstruction in Louisiana. And he will propose a plan that black people, including free black people, and those enlisted in the military, deserve the right to vote. Now, he just said that that was his feeling. He did not ever propose any legislation. And don't forget, in 1862, Lincoln also talked about freeing the slaves, compensating the slave owners, and colonizing the ex slaves in Central and South America. Of course, 3 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And so it will fall to his successor to put the plans for Reconstruction into place. Uh, his successor will be Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson will be the first, eventually will be the first president who will be impeached. And he became very close to being removed from office. Um, and Johnson announced his plans for Reconstruction. And you got to remember, Johnson was from Tennessee. Thus he was a Southerner, and he did not believe in the um, abilities of African Americans. He just did not believe that slavery should exist, and also he did not like he had problems with the slave holders, especially the large slave holders that had led the South to secession. So he was against secession. He might have also even been against slavery, but he was no lover of black people. All right. So what he did come up with is that the South, to be readmitted, didn't have to give up their rights to govern themselves. And he also believed that the federal government had no right to determine voting requirements, or there are just certain questions that he believed that should be decided on the state level. So, under Johnson's plan of Reconstruction, all the land that had been confiscated by the Union Army, and that would be whenever the Union Army went somewhere and occupied that land, uh, all the land that had been confiscated by the Union Army and had been given to the formerly enslaved people by the Army or by the Freedmen's Bureau, he believed it should be given back to the owners. In other words, Andrew Johnson was rewarding the people who had led uh, the the traders. I would call them traders. Uh, it's almost like they were not going to be punished for what they did. And the people who had been loyal, who would be the ex-slaves, and who had been given this land by the Union Army, left up to Andrew Johnson. They were going to have to let that land revert back to the slave owners. Okay? The one thing he would do is that he did believe that the 13th Amendment to the Constitution should be passed. And the 13th Amendment to the Constitution will end slavery. He did believe that the ex-Confederates had to swear allegiance to the United States and they had to pay off the debt. But other than that, he was going to allow the southern states to control themselves. And that meant that controlling themselves would mean they were going to determine how to deal with the African Americans. Okay? And so, as a result of Johnson's leniency, many of the southern states in 1865 and 1866 will enact a series of laws that we call the Black Codes. And the Black Codes were designed to restrict, notice I said restrict, freed black people's activity and to assure that they were available to work. For example, one of them will say by January the 1st, uh, uh, African Americans had to sign a labor contract. And if they hadn't signed a labor contract with someone, then that person could be arrested. And if you were arrested, then you would be arrested for being a vagrant. And that would mean that you would be placed in a jail. And the jailer would have the possibility or had the ability to hire that person out and to, of course, make them work, but work for whomever the jailer wanted them to work for. Another one of the black codes is that a black person could not testify against anyone white in court. The black codes will not create schools. You were not supposed to use tax money to create black schools. Basically, the simple way of stating it with the black codes that you would take the slave codes, mark out the word slave, and insert black. So whatever restrictions there were against black people before the Civil War, they were going to be maintained after the Civil War under Johnson's plan. The only thing would be is that technically they were going to be legally free, but in actuality they were not. Uh, and the Northerns, many of the people in the North will be outraged with what was doing, and they were outraged because they had problems with allowing the Southerners to just return to the way things were before the Civil War without being punished. And so they will refuse to seat the Congress people, they refuse to seat the senators. In early 1866, Congress will pass a bill that will be important to African Americans, and that will be the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau will be like the Department of Human Education and Welfare. It will be the Freedmen's Bureau will be set up to help the ex-slaves to adjust to freedom. It will help them sign labor contracts. It will help them to legalize marriages. And the Freedmen's Bureau will play a crucial role in building schools for African Americans in the South. And one of those institutions is still existing, and that will be Howard University. Howard University will be started by the Freedmen's Bureau. And I know the institution where I started, not started, where I came from before Simmons, Berea College, there was a building on campus that was used until 1970 that was built by the Freedmen's Bureau. So if there's one important thing that you should remember from and do more research about this stage of Reconstruction, it will be the Freedmen's Bureau. All right. So there ended up being a battle between Johnson and Congress, and Johnson, certain bills he would veto, and Congress would pass them over a veto. And so, besides the Freedmen's Bureau, the first Civil Rights Act of 1868 will come into existence, and this will try to establish rights for African Americans. But eventually, what will occur is that after the northern states rejected Johnson's plans, in 1866, a group called Radical Republicans took control of Reconstruction of the South. And this is when you began to get what radical Reconstruction, some historians call Black Reconstruction. This is when three groups, the ex-slaves, the Radical Republicans, and Democrats, who were white Democrats who were willing to work with them, began to develop a plan of Reconstruction that was more respective, considerate of the rights and the new status of African Americans who had formerly been in slavery. Okay. For example, what this group will do, they will divide in the Reconstruction Act of 1867, they will divide the South into 5 military districts, and It will outline how the governments in those five military districts, the state governments, were supposed to be organized. Uh, it- the law will require that southern states to be readmitted to the Union will have to pass the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And the 14th Amendment to the Constitution will define citizenship, and it will make it very clear that African Americans or ex slaves were citizens. Remember the Dred Scott decision, which said that they were not? The 14th Amendment will make it very clear that they were. And the Confederate States, ex Confederate states, will have to pass the 14th Amendment before they could rejoin the Union. In February 1869, Congress approved the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which will be adopted in 1870. And this will guarantee a citizen's right to vote. Will not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Notice I said on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In other words, ex-slaves will have the right to vote. But remember, with the 14th Amendment, it only applied to males. So females, it didn't make any difference. Their race or ethnicity could not vote. So before Southern states could be readmitted to the Union, they had to pass the 14th Amendment. They granted citizenship, made it very clear that African Americans were citizens, and the 15th Amendment, which made it very clear that African American males had the right to vote. So let's talk about what happened during this time period. Uh, and what you want to do is some research about what we call is Reconstruction. Okay. Now, by 1870, all of the former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union, and the constitutions that will be drawn up in this time period will be the most progressive in the region's history, and that is what will occur during what I would call Black Reconstruction, and I'll tell you in a few minutes about some of the progress that will be made during this time period. The constitutions will be the most progressive in the history of the South up to that time. Um, for example, this will be when you establish public schools. Uh, Up to this time, the South did not have public schools. Now, the schools will be segregated because I think this is something that blacks and whites wanted. But we're talking about taxpayers helping to pay for schools. Okay? Uh, so the most radical development of Reconstruction is going to be, you could call it, it will be an interracial democracy that will involve, as I said before, radical Republicans who were white and Democrats, Southern Democrats who were white, and African Americans. Okay. Now, let's look at what will occur during this time period. Besides what I said, the state-funded public school systems, a more equitable tax system will be developed in all of the southern states where this group was involved. There will be laws against racial discrimination in public transportation and accommodation. And there will be ambitious economic development programs, including aid to railroads and other enterprises. In other words, some of the things we would think are normal right now will occur during radical or black reconstruction. And when I use that term, probably one of the best studies still about this time period in history, Black Reconstruction, was written by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. And remember, Du Bois, and we'll talk about him more when we start talking about education and comparing him to Booker T. Washington. Du Bois will be the first African American to graduate and to earn a doctorate degree from Harvard University. And his dissertation will be on Black Reconstruction. And even to this day, it is considered one of the best. One of the best. Now, what happened during Black Reconstruction? Okay, let me just give you some examples. In the state of Mississippi, okay, for a time period, both United States senators in Mississippi were black men. One was Hiram Revels, Hiram, Revels, and his the other one was Blanche K. Bruce. So for a while, Mississippi, for a short period of time, it was a short period of time, but at least it happened. Both senators in, in the state of Mississippi were African American. For 43 days in Louisiana, after the governor got impeached and removed, the governor of the state of Louisiana was an African American, and his name was P. Period B. Period S. Period Pinchback, Pinchback. Okay. During this time period, there will be 16 African Americans elected to Congress. 16 African Americans elected to Congress. And initially, Congress did not want to seat them. So you could just be elected, but Congress did not want to seat them, but eventually they were. Okay. In terms of writing the new constitutions for the southern states, 265 African Americans participated in the process of writing the constitutions in the different states. And of that 265, 100 of them had been slaves. So 265 across the South helped to write the constitutions, and 100 of them had been slaves. There were a total of over 600 black state legislators. So if you add up the number of legislators in the southern states of the ex-Confederacy, over 600 of them were African Americans. Now, for a short period of time, uh, as I mentioned earlier, that the land of ex-Confederates uh, would be confiscated and it was given to their to their ex-slaves. For example, Jefferson Davis, who had been the president of the Confederacy, his land in Mississippi was given to the ex-slaves. Um, but under Andrew Johnson, the ex-slaves were forced to give that land back to uh, Jefferson Davis, and it happened in other places. And why I'm mentioning that point, despite all the political gains, and despite African Americans being males being able to vote, African American males being able to serve in the legislature, African American males going to Congress, African American males helping to write some of the most progressive uh, legislation in the history of the South. Despite all those things, white Southerners were pissed. They were pissed because they were being forced to do what they didn't want to do, and that was to treat African Americans as citizens. So legally, African Americans had all the rights as someone white. It will be the reality that will be different from what the law. So in other words, the law can say one thing, but reality can be something else. I still believe that part of the downfall is that land that was taken away from African Americans, and this happened throughout the South, okay, that African Americans did not gain 40 acres and a mule. If by not gaining 40 acres and a mule, and that was a piece of legislation that was proposed in Congress, but never became reality. That meant that African Americans had to depend upon and to work for the same people that who had enslaved them. Okay? They had to turn around and go back and work for the slave and their ex-slave owners who still had, who were still racist, just to be flat out. They could not control their economic destiny. Now, there will be some places that they will maintain their land. If you go to Hilton Head and if you go to uh, Myrtle Beach, there's what you would call the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina. And this was true in Hilton Head and Myrtle Beach. Especially Hilton Head. At one time, a large percentage of the land around Hilton Head was owned by African Americans. That they had gotten some of their ancestors had gotten the land in 1862, and they held on to it. But then what began to happen is Hilton Head and Myrtle Beach became more popular as uh, not tennis, tourist destinations. Uh, the children began to sell it, uh, or the taxes were so high that the white attorneys came in and I guess you could say just took it away, and we lost control of it. So I am saying part of the downfall of Reconstruction will be that. Now, how did Reconstruction come to an end? Well, after 1867, an increasing number of Southern whites began to turn to violence in response to the changes that occurred under radical Reconstruction. It's one of those things, even though the changes, many of the changes were better and would make life better for Southern whites, they were upset because African Americans were involved in that. It would be an example of, from my perspective, if you ask many whites in 2012 about Obamacare, they disliked it. They really couldn't stand Obamacare. But then if you go ask the question to them, what did they think about the Affordable Care Act? They loved it. And there are surveys that verify what I just said. Okay, when they thought an African American was involved, they automatically says was something that they did not like. But when you took race out of it, then the whites, especially in Kentucky, certain parts of Kentucky, uh, they were okay. They were okay with it. In other words, even though the bill, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare helps them if they don't have insurance, they were upset because Obama's name was attached to it. And I am saying this is what will happen in Reconstruction. Public schools, tax systems that were more equalized, economic development for companies and so forth. It benefited not only African Americans, but it also benefited whites. But the whites were upset because they had lost the Civil War. They were upset because legally they were supposed to treat African Americans as equals. This is where I think you go from Reconstruction being a dream to where it became a nightmare. But before we talk about Reconstruction coming to an end, remember, do not forget in Reconstruction from 1865, okay, 1865 to 1900 is when many of your HBCUs began. This is when many of your HBCUs began. And you will find that wherever there was an HBCU or a black school, quite often there will be a church involved in it. And I'm saying that the African Americans of that generation understood the importance of education. And the churches were involved in that because it was important to know how to read in order to also be able to read the Bible. So the two work hand in hand. So I want to make sure that we focus upon there were positives to Reconstruction. We talked about the political positives. We talked about the Freedmen's Bureau. We talked about the education and the schools that will be created, and so many of them still exist. Uh, when we talk about that 1865 to 1900 time period, I know Simmons was created, I think, in 1879, so it will be after this. But you will see that the individuals in what is now called the General Association of Baptists in Kentucky were already moving in this direction before Simmons became a formal institution. That they understood that to become, I guess, to try to make sure that they understood the value of education and citizenship. All right. So what will grow out of Reconstruction to end it? Organization, well, the one that it's not the only one. It's not the only white supremacist organization. but the primary one will be the Ku Klux Klan. It was created by Nathan Bedford Forrest. I think it was Paris, Tennessee. And remember, I mentioned him before. He was the leader of the Confederacy in at Fort Pillow that slaughtered that slaughtered the black soldiers. All right. So, and what began to happen then is the Klan began to use violence to target local Republican leaders, white and black, and any other individual who would challenge white authority. And you got to remember at that time when you went to vote, you had to vote in the open. Everybody knew how you were going to vote. So it took a brave person in some rural area, let's say where my family is from, but Bullitt County, Alabama, to vote against somebody white, and you're living on that person's land, and you were a sharecropper. Uh, it took a lot of bravery because it's odds are that if that once the white person found out how you were going to vote and did vote, your family would be kicked off of the land. Okay, so I am saying that by using the Klan and other means, what will occur is that Reconstruction will come to an end. And even though the federal government under Ulysses S. Grant will try to end the Klan and other organizations that attempted to interfere with black suffrage, and that black suffrage, we're talking about voting, and other political rights, white supremacy gradually reinserted its hold on the South. I guess you could say Northerners got tired and they began to say, well, how long are we supposed to help these people? And they got tired. And while they were getting tired, Southern whites were not getting tired. So I'm saying racism was a potent force in both the North and the South. And I said North and the South. Northerners had segregation when Southerners had slavery. And eventually the Republicans became more conservative. They became less egalitarian in the decade the in the 1870s, and by 1876 uh, there was an election, a presidential election that will mark the end of Reconstruction, and basically there really was a dispute about the Electoral College. Three states will submit two sets of election returns. One of them, uh, the Democrat Tilden won, and the other set of returns, the Republican Hayes would win. And the politicians, once again, made a compromise, and the compromise that Rutherford B. Hayes would get all the electoral votes and become president of the United States, and in return, all of the federal troops would be removed. And when the federal troops were removed, that meant the Klan and whites who supported them had free reign to do whatever they wanted to do. So, what's the legacy of Reconstruction? There were negatives, there were positives, but what it did show that when given the opportunity, African Americans working with whites who wanted to work with them created some very positive and progressive legislation that and not only have benefited African Americans, but also benefited their white counterparts. But the problem was still racism, racism. And so that's why a century later, the legacy of Reconstruction would be revived during the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. And what will come after Reconstruction is a time period uh, that I know that I was born, and a time period that we need to talk about and sometimes wonder how did African Americans survive, and that will be the Jim Crow era, the era of legal segregation. And that will be the next lecture. So I hope you learned something about Reconstruction, positive, negative, time period after the American Civil War. Uh, but remember, it may have come to an end, but don't forget what will be left. In many cases, will be many of our churches were established during this time period. Many of our schools were established during this time period. We had individuals who were in Congress, in the state legislatures, uh, but unfortunately, we did not get that 40 acres interview. Bye.